this is a big web for you. I mean, only yesterday you announced the largest budget ever to save and improve lives globally. Unless you're a little bit frustrated that not many people think about health. Why?
Health is, pretty central to the human condition. If you go back over 100 years, about a third of all kids died before the age of 5. And in rich countries, those numbers went down. By the turn of the century, we had gotten to where about 10 million kids died every year under the age of 5, and mostly in poor countries, partly because the death rates were 20 times higher there and because a lot of the births were there. And this is, one of the great stories ever is how we use things like Gavi that was introduced here at Davos to get out vaccines to all the world's children and cut that down below 5 million a year. So it had visibility, it was a priority in funding, it's a priority in terms of innovation, and that's the Gates Foundation's primary area. Today, we do face some headwinds, not on the innovation side. The innovation side, we've got AI, we have many new tools coming, but the actual funding for delivery, aid budgets are flat overall, so that means the amount of money for health in Africa is going down quite a bit as other topics come up. You'd hope that as people say, hey, here's new money for climate or some other cause, that they'd maintain their commitment to the high impact interventions. We'll see as we raise money for Gavi, can we get an increase? Can we stay flat? Or is the most impactful aid in the world pushing us for that 5 million to go back up instead of what, if we really are vigilant, sometime in the 2030s, we'll be able to get that down to 2.5 million.
But why is that so hard? And again, is it because people's perception is that there are other crises that they need to fight, and so this, goes down the priority list?
Well, the first thing that would be ideal is if countries would get to 0.7% in their aid budget, and then you would have room for Ukraine and climate and education and vaccines. We'd be in great shape. People were at that 0.7%. And so the Gates Foundation is the biggest advocate for overall generosity there, and then making sure the health portion, which is very high impact, to make sure that that's well spent and that the voters who get behind that feel good about, okay, you're responsible for this result with only a tiny, tiny portion of your budget. And there are not only humanitarian benefits, stability, economy, environment, huge benefits, because as we make the world healthy, that's where you get the population growth actually gets to a steady state.
So what do you want to focus on in health? And we have some actually pretty incredible gadgets that use also AI to scan, for example, when if females are pregnant, whether the baby is okay. But in the next 2 to 3 years, what would your priorities be?
Well, I've been amazed at the speed of innovation, and that's even before now we'll use AI tools to design new vaccines and get at the very toughest problems, like getting a great HIV vaccine. This is a device that'll cost $1,000 or less, and we connect it to AI software, and so the cost per delivery is less than $1, where you scan and you see, is there anything about the cord or the amniotic sac that woman is likely going to need a C-section. And so we funded looking at tens of thousands of pregnancies and showed the AI here, this one came out normal, this one came out abnormal. And so it's even better than the best human at doing that prediction. And so, even in rural Africa, you connect this to a cell phone, you do the scan, tells you what you need to know, and that would cut maternal deaths in half if we made it broadly available.
And so what's the challenge in making, and I've seen pictures, it's incredible. You can really hook it up to an iPad, and you can kind of see, even when there's a nurse in a village of 10 females. What's the challenge in getting that to the right place at scale?
Well, we had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to invent this, and now it's going through the regulatory process, and that's also very expensive. Sadly, there's no natural market for this. You know, the people who benefit from it have very little money, so the normal market mechanism of, is this a priority for the innovation agenda, without governments being generous in philanthropy, it just never happens. But it's coming together. I was in Kenya seeing the work, and you know, we'll get it out there. We have partnerships with lots of the ultrasound companies, including Philips, who, if we fund it, they work with us very well.
And this is an HPV single dose. So you basically have a backpack of goodies that saves lives.
Yeah, there's a ton of this stuff. And here with HPV, we did something pretty amazing. We brought the cost of the vaccine down by bringing a lot of manufacturers in, people like Serum, some Chinese manufacturers. But we also did something that was very expensive and risky, is we went out and really studied women who'd only gotten one dose of the vaccine and showed that they were as protected as well as people who'd had 2 or 3 doses. And that means that given that, you know, the vaccine budget is super limited, because now we're at single dose, which over 20 countries have adopted, we can protect twice as many women with our very limited resources as we could when the view was that you had to get out there with 2 doses. And you know, it's not, you know, who's motivated to spend tens of millions of dollars and prove something like that. It just, you know, there's no market mechanism that ever proves you need less doses.
But politicians, are they listening? So we have multiple crises. It's wars, it's climate change, it's inflation. I mean, has healthcare worldwide really dropped off the list when you speak to world leaders?
Well, when we raised money for Global Fund a year ago, we actually end up with a little bit less money, which is tragic. As we raise, and Global Fund works on TB, malaria, and HIV. So we raise money for Gavi at the end of this year. As we see, does the U.S. maintain its commitment to its HIV work, which is both its PEPFAR bilateral work, and it's by far the largest donor, 25% of the Global Fund. We'll see if these, you know, high impact, saving lives for less than $1,000 per life saved, if in the face of things that, you know, are not as dramatic, you know, those are getting more attention. You know, if we had held a meeting on global health, I don't think we'd get 70,000 people to come. You know, we'd work hard to get 700 people to come. And yet, if you want people to be dealing with climate change, making sure a kid has good nutrition is by far more impactful, because then even if there's a little bit more malaria or a little bit more heat, that's what makes them incredibly resilient. And yet, that nutrition research and investments, they're not counted in this quota of, okay, let's shift the money. And global health is a little bit off the radar screen right now.
So you've really made healthcare your life's work. And I think this morning you said, look, you're a little bit jealous of the attention of COP.
Well, I'm involved in climate change as well. I'm actually you know, I do more philanthropy for climate change than anyone else does. I fund more private companies. It's a very important issue over the long run. You know, as fields mature, you figure out how to spend money well. And in the year 2000, global health, we weren't doing autopsies. That's a thing the Gates Foundation funds to really understand the burden of disease. We weren't gathering the data. We fund international health metrics to do that. And the donors weren't engaged in working together. And so that's been super successful. Climate's at a very early stage, and so a lot of these grants are not high impact, not very good at measuring it. The innovation agenda there, which will also be AI supercharged, is very exciting. So I'm actually optimistic about climate and health, but for the next 10 years, where money's going to be so limited, we need, you know, if you want to care about health, climate impacts, the health spending should go up, not down.
Are you worried about elections around the world and the fact that actually it could also change our, I guess, dedication or spending in general towards some of these
the
causes.
challenge I talked about is before you factor in the potential of having governments that don't really care about their role in the world and don't want to go forward with the generosity of spirit working with others. So that would be, for example, the U.S. commitment to HIV. If that goes away, that's tens of millions of deaths. So that's really big. I mean, that's way more than all the wars put together.
Can the private companies step in to try and fill a potential void?
They basically no. Companies can help. They can help with the visibility. They can help with the innovation. They can. There's a lot they can do, but the $130 billion of aid money that's given, we're not going to get the private sector, even philanthropy, to make up any shortfalls there. It's just the numbers don't work.
Malaria, I mean, this is also a huge topic that needs to be addressed.
Well, malaria is, when we first got started, of those 10 million deaths, 1 million of them were malaria deaths. That's down to 500,000. And we have incredible tools. We work, for example, with the chemical companies on bed nets. We fund the trials. We have a next generation of bed nets that deals with the resistance. We have some very incredible tools that will take 5 years to deploy that called Gene Drive that are for decimating mosquito populations, and used in combination with prophylaxis and treatment, we have a chance of reducing the malaria map and eventually getting to full eradication. That's probably a 20-year thing. The lifetime of our foundation is right about that. So, we're working on polio's our big eradication right now, along with some of the neglected diseases like guinea worm. But as we succeed in that, with malaria, with measles, we need to get rid of them altogether.
Is the U.S., and of course it's a big election year, if Donald Trump comes into the White House, but even under a Biden second administration, what does that mean for all of these? What does it mean exactly for how much they're going to spend on health? How will they deal with climate change and even AI?
Well, the U.S., in terms of fostering climate innovation, the IRA is the biggest thing that ever happened in the world in terms of accelerating climate innovation. And so a lot of the companies, I'm in over 120 companies that work on the different areas of emissions, they are moving much faster. Some of them couldn't even exist without those tax credits, which over time will allow them to get green technologies that don't bear what I call a green premium. And so you can make cement around the world with no emissions, but not paying more. At first, it will cost more, and that's why the learning curve tax credits in the IRA are so critical to not just solving this problem for the US, but solving it for the entire world. Scale up, it matters if those green premiums are eliminated or are brought down to be very low. So certainly in climate and caring about the world, voters will be somewhat expressing their moral views in terms of who they pick going forward. Should the WHO and should its work continue? Should PEPFAR continue? It's a question.
But if the U.S. doesn't fulfill that role, are there other countries that can step up?
Not a chance.
Not even if they come together?
Oh, I mean, the U.S. is the world's biggest economy. The percentage of innovation that's issue in the, and I go to every government and I say, please be more generous. But I've never been able to say, hey, the U.S. Is being selfish. Why don't you go to your taxpayers and say, hey, let's make up for U.S. selfishness? That pitch has never really gotten that much traction. So no, the figure of merit is percentage of GDP. 0.7% is considered very generous. Only Norway and Sweden are above that. Germany's at that level. The UK was at that level, went back down to 0.5. The US is at 0.24, which, when Bush came into office, we were at 0.1. The biggest increase in my lifetime was during President Bush administration. He did a malaria program, both of the HIV programs, pretty incredible. And that's been maintained on a bipartisan basis. It's only now that we see it being attacked, so it hangs in the balance. We had a great 20-year celebration last year of the over 20 million lives that have been saved with that program.
But I mean, a lot of the time you spend is also to making sure that healthcare is top of the agenda, right? That it's almost like a market.
Well, if you care about humans, child to death, women bleeding to death, and we're not talking about small numbers. We're talking about millions and millions. And people decide, is that, a priority for a tiny part of their budgets? Should there be more giving? All these things can help. And it's a very positive thing because, I have, dozens of innovations that have been funded over these last 10 years that are very low cost and ready to roll out. And that's why the 2.5 million is within reach if we stay focused on these things. And that would get you to 2% of kids dying before the age of 5. No. Rich countries are 1%. And so you'd be within a factor of 2 of, sort of the basic statement of the Gates Foundation, which is all lives have equal value. So we won't get there in my lifetime, but we will get close if we stay involved and committed.
I mean, COVID has also changed our relationship to healthcare. What does that mean for vaccination hesitancy in developing countries and developed nations?
Well, the misinformation about vaccines and associating certain people like myself or Fauci having malign intent with vaccines, that was most acute in the United States. But the pandemic, which you would have thought, wow, global health research, to talking about health, being ready for the next pandemic, when you've got millions of deaths, isn't that, it's sad, it's tragic, but isn't at least there a benefit that health is on the agenda? Sadly, it's a topic nobody wants to talk about because it was painful, it's over, let's move on from that. And even the idea of, okay, the importance of WHO, the importance of vaccine research, and telling people, hey, vaccines really are very well tested, that's a question. Historically, when we've had vaccine hesitancy, for example, in Nigeria in 2001, the polio campaign faced disaster when some politicians said that oral polio vaccine was sterilizing Muslim women. And it took us 5 years working with the religious leaders where they would visibly vaccinate their children and talk about where the vaccine came and how it avoided children being paralyzed or dying. And we were able to get rid of polio from Nigeria. We have 2 countries left, Afghanistan and Pakistan, where we've never gotten to zero. It's spread back to Africa, so we have to also clean that up. But the hardest part that we're very close on, with a little bit of luck in a few years, we should be able to get to zero, is Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Bill Gates, we have 2 minutes left. How do you harness AI to be good, actually, for humankind?
Well, AI, I'd say that it's going to raise productivity generally. And normal capital markets with great competition from Microsoft and Google will drive that. And you should all pay attention because it is so dramatic how it improves white-collar productivity. And later with the robotics, not yet, but eventually blue-collar productivity. So that is phenomenal for the world. The world will be richer and, can work less and have more. The place where it's with equity, and we have a huge commitment to make sure there's not this normal 20-year lag between benefit to the rich versus to developing countries, is that there's a bigger teacher shortage in Africa than elsewhere, a bigger doctor shortage. And so not only will we invent new tools using AI, like the ultrasound, we will provide health advice and directly, in their local African language, fully tailored to the conditions in those countries. We will provide an AI doctor. We will provide an AI tutor. And already we've funded lots of Africans to do pilot studies and to take the very best technology and get it out at about the same time as it'll happen in the rich world. In fact, in a few cases, rich world regulations may make it roll out slower than in countries like India or in Africa. So it's a race, but it's a race for good. And I couldn't be more thrilled. It's a case where my ongoing work with Microsoft, helps me understand how we take this into the developing countries.
So, but overall, you're net positive on AI in general, globally.
AI
for everything.
AI is a brilliant tool for people to be more productive. Now, it means the bad guys will be more productive, so they can do more cyber attacks, so they can design weapons. You always, the internet, the microprocessor, all these things helped everybody be more efficient, including the bad guys. And so you've got to make sure the best AI for cyber defense or measures to defend against bioterrorism are in the hand of the good guys. And it's a challenge, but people sometimes lose sight of the fact that this is the biggest productivity advance in our lifetimes.